This is the inaugural event for this Waterloo chapter of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. And SAFS is a national organization devoted to protecting academic freedom and meritocratic hiring. Both sort of antiquated principles at this point. And McGill created a local chapter about a year ago. And we thought it was appropriate to set one up in Waterloo. And we wanted to kick it off with having a conversation with Charles Pincourt, who's written a book with James Lindsay. Charles is the first author. I saw drafts of this floating around on the internet, about a year ago. Charles is a pseudonym. We're not going to say, who he really is or where he is. But I wanted to do this with him because I had a kind of a funny event happen back in March. I work at Wilfrid Laurier, and I'm in the School of Business and Economics, and we'd had a workplace consultant do a set of interviews, and then they came out with a recommendation in December. We had a big faculty meeting, and they had two key recommendations. They documented the usual stuff that people were mean to each other, that was it. Basically, people were mean to each other, and they said, well, what you really need to do is, number one, get more diversity, equity, and inclusion. And number two is instantiate a code of respect. And I thought, oh, these are just terrible ideas. And I worked on trying to write a letter to my colleagues to explain why I thought it was so bad for the university to do both of those things. And I sat down around the Christmas holiday and I wrote about 5,000 words. Knew that wasn't going to work. So I kind of refined it. And then we had a faculty meeting in March, and I got it down to about 1,100 words. And I actually presented it at a faculty meeting. I read out the essay. And after I was finished, the first thing the dean said to me was, I disagree with everything you just said. And I had a few faculty members reach out to me, and they said, we kind of generally agree with the principles that you were espousing, but we thought you were too harsh. And I thought, too harsh, these aren't my ideas. I'm just the messenger. So I thought Charles's book is it's a handbook on how to combat woke at the university, but not just the university, at really any institution that's got any sort of bureaucratic structure. And so I thought I want to do this for my colleagues. And of course, we have so many people attending today that aren't my colleagues. But I think what he's going to share today is really useful information for trying to bring some allies on side if you feel like you're confronting woke on your own your organization. So okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to David Haskell right now. He's going to provide some preliminary comments, and then we've got some questions for Charles. So I'll turn it over to you, David.
Great, thanks, Will. So if you haven't read the book that Charles wrote, it's called Counter Wokecraft. So it's Counter Wokecraft. And we're going to be getting into the definitions on that. What I wanted to do, even before we move toward the interview with Charles discussing his book, I wanted to place us in time and also in our culture, and just say why a book like this and why strategies like this are so necessary. But in order to do that, I'm quickly just going to go through some examples from our own university. Like Will, I'm a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. Some of you know me if you're attending. And I want to show just how woke has grown. And so I'm trying to heighten our sensibility on this. I'm trying to prime you to say, wow, this is very serious, and therefore it's something that we need to combat. So I'm going to start just in 2015 and only talk about Laurier. And I could talk about numerous universities or businesses or nonprofits, but I'm going to focus on what I know best, my own university. So let's start in 2015, because that's when things started to really accelerate. So this is a timeline of woke, and it's not everything. It's just the examples that I could fit into about 5 minutes. So in 2015, our university rejected a gift of 22 bronze statues of prime ministers, full life, because they embodied white supremacy, we were told, and would harm racialized students. Now, there's a certain irony there, because at that point, Laurier believed that history has no place on a university campus. So then it was also setting a trend, incidentally. At Laurier in 2015, they were only banning statues. Come 2020, they'd actually start ripping them down with their hands. So then we moved to 2016. Well, in 2016, we saw the diversity office begin to support and encourage a student mob that then went out and vandalized a campus pro-life event. And an investigation was launched into the vandalization, and it was found, this is the student council saying this, they said that the pro-life group, which had been there with permission, had made the campus unsafe. So actually it was the pro-life group that was vandalized that were punished. Well, then we can move on to 2016 again. At the Brantford campus, there was going to be a lawyer from Toronto come and speak about women in the law. Well, a mob of students inspired by several faculty made sure that this woman couldn't speak. They threatened violence. They said that things would get violent. And why did they agitate until she wouldn't come? Well, in her duties as a lawyer, this woman had defended that famous radio celebrity of CBC, Jian Ghomeshi, who had been accused, probably rightly so, but accused nonetheless, of sexual assault on women. But the fact that she had done her job as a lawyer was enough for them to say, she makes the campus unsafe, so they shut her down. Well, then in late 2016, we had the bombshell of all bombshells at Laurier. It was the Lindsay Shepherd affair. You may have heard about it. Lindsay was an MA student. She was doing a tutorial, and in it, she showed a Jordan Peterson video. Well, she was subsequently told that she'd violated the gender and gender violence policy of the university, had also violated probably law C-16, and she was in danger of being expelled. It was because students had complained, she was told. Anyway, her professors had lied. Her professors had engaged the Diversity and Equity Office to also bully her. An independent investigator was brought in, and it was determined that Lindsay had done nothing wrong. Now, in these cases, by the way, back with the pro-life group that was bullied, the woman lawyer who was not allowed to speak, Will and I have been active trying to get that story out. We contact the media. Often we run national op-eds. With the Lindsay Shepherd story, certainly it garnered a lot of media attention, and you'd think that things would begin to change, but they didn't. So now let's move to 2018. In 2018, our university instituted a security fee policy, which was a backdoor effort to make sure that conservative speakers, or anyone they deemed off base, not speaking the woke narrative, they couldn't speak because they'd say, well, you're going to be a danger to the campus, therefore we need to charge you thousands of dollars in order to speak, which effectively made sure that those people couldn't speak. So we saw that happen in 2018. Moving into 2020. So in 2020, our administration claimed that our campus was systemically racist, and they actually put out a public statement to that effect and said that they were going to make major changes because our campus was systemically racist. Well, Will and I, true to form, we called them on it. We published a public letter. It gained national and international media attention. And essentially we said that there was no scholarly evidence put forward in this claim by our university administrators. This is ironic, given that it's a university that bases its entire purpose and mission on presenting scholarly evidence. Well, unlike in the past, where even though when we've gotten media attention, nothing's happened, this time something did happen. This time a mob formed that came after us, emboldened by the university administrators themselves. Will and I began to see people trying to get us fired. Groups were formed on campus to try and get us fired. it's become more hostile. There's even a page on the Wilfrid Laurier website that actually instructs students how they can deal with professors. It's dedicated to Will and I, without our names being mentioned, but how you can use human rights complaints in order to get rid of us. And we've been subjected to human rights complaints. They never go anywhere because we actually don't do anything, but it's just to make our lives unbearable until they can find another reason to fire us. Lastly, let's go to 2001, the largest controversy at all to date, when our university decided that it would no longer respect the bodily autonomy, the informed consent, or the right to medical privacy of our students. Will and I, again, publicly spoke out against this in national op-eds, podcasts, anyone who would listen, basically, but nothing has changed. So let me get to the final point on this as I've gone through this litany of things where we've demonstrated this woke culture on campus. I keep saying that nothing changed, except when it got worse for Will and I. So you might be wondering, well, if this has been your history, that sounds fairly dystopic. It sounds like it's not a very pleasant future for us. And I think maybe it won't be. But we need to discuss these things. And we're here tonight because if we're going to combat this woke ideology, we need to work at strategies. We can't just lay down and take it. In fact, I would argue that it's because we have been laying down and taking it that this has happened. One on one, we're not strong enough. But if we can grow together as a group, yeah, I'm a bit skeptical, but we don't have any other option now. If we want true fairness to take hold in our universities or in our businesses, in our nonprofits, in our churches, wherever you are, if you want true fairness, then you're going to have to do something. All of us have to do something for the results to be different. So that's why we're here. And I think now we can get to the questions. Oh, you're muted, Will.
I'm new to Zoom. This is my first pandemic. I don't. What a rookie mistake. So I'm going to ask the first question, and I have to ask the most obvious question, Charles. This is a tough one because you talk about different types of woke and in non-woke, dissidents and allies. I don't. Did I tell people that Charles Pincourt is not your real name? And you'll notice, and anyone who's here will notice that we're not going to see your face. You write under a pseudonym. Why do you remain anonymous? And do you think the anonymity provides a problematic example, given the reason we're in this mess is that too many academics who secretly oppose woke ideology refuse to go public?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's a fair question. The the reason I ever did this was because I did it anonymously, and I remain anonymous mostly because I was afraid of losing my job, and it wasn't just me, of course, that was involved in this decision. I'm married and I have a young family, and so that made my wife quite anxious that I could lose my job, and obviously I was worried about that too. So I mean, it's pretty straightforward why I decided to remain anonymous. Whether it's problematic, the word problematic is funny because that's like a woke word, problematic. So I think the way I would answer it would be something more like it. I agree that it's not ideal to be anonymous, and I don't think I always will be. And I can sort of explain why I think that might be the case as part of the answer. But for the time being, I am, and here obviously I am. And but so I've got a long answer for this. The apart from why I want to remain anonymous, if I hadn't been anonymous, I don't think I ever would have done this. I never would have started writing a blog. I was paranoid I've been living with this for many years, trying to talk with people, trying to work with all kinds of different people, try to make, counter what I saw as, at the time, it was difficult for me to even put a name to it. At the time, it was really what I just called the critical perspective. And I saw it taking over everywhere, but I saw it directly taking over my department in a matter of years. When I was explaining to Will just before that when I started in my position in 2000, around 10 years ago, there was 1 in 4 people in the department that were adherents to the critical social justice perspective, and within 5 years, that number had gone from 1 in 4 to 1 in 2. So that more than half the department were adherents to the critical social justice perspective. And that's when I decided that I really needed to kind of figure out what to do and try to start to do something. And so I tried to do all kinds of different things. I felt like I learned many things along the way, and I felt like I wanted to tell people about it, but I still felt that it was just too high a cost or a potential risk. And so I had what I call my New York Times moment. Not New York Times, a New Yorker moment. There's a cartoon in the New Yorker from many years ago, 20, maybe 30 years ago. And it has a picture of one dog sitting on a chair looking in front of a computer, and he's looking down at another dog. And he's explaining to the other dog that nobody knows that you're a dog on the internet. And that's I thought about that comic, and I thought, oh yeah, well, maybe I can just do this anonymously, and that's what got me launched. But I was terribly paranoid. The fact that I did everything behind VPNs. I obviously had this special identity, but I had to, I tried out many different identities at first to figure out how I could get a Twitter account, because I knew that would be important. And anyhow, that's kind of the long and the short of it. But there's 2 other things that I wanted to add to it. One is that, there's the Marines, but there's also still a CIA. So it's not just as war is not just as straightforward as getting people up to the front lines and taking out the guns and firing things. There's all kinds of things that need to happen surreptitiously, or that can happen surreptitiously, that can also be useful. So I think that's one way to think of it. And if you've read the book, and if you see the image that I use is actually George Smiley from Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. A lot of the way that I've been looking at Wokecraft and counter Wokecraft is through the angle of military, but also intelligence operations.
So I'll just jump in quickly.
Go ahead.
And Charles, again, I appreciate what you've done, and providing this manual for people is an excellent resource, and it is necessary. The larger point that I would make, and everyone has circumstance, and I'm not judging here. Mm-hmm. My worry is that that unless we are more courageous, then being anonymous actually gives permission to other people to be anonymous who won't do as much work as you've done, mm-hmm. but they'll just rationalize it. And I recall, back in the day when I did my degree in philosophy as an undergrad, and Immanuel Kant talks about the categorical imperative, mm-hmm. where, you can judge something as right or wrong if you can translate it to a universal rule. Mm-hmm. So if we said it is a universal rule that everyone should be anonymous who wants to fight woke, I can guarantee you that they will overrun us next week. Mm-hmm. Like we will not be able to win this. Mm-hmm. So I would, and again, when you say you could get fired, you can get fired. Mm-hmm. Frances Widdowson, who's with us today in the audience, she's proof of this. Mm-hmm. There are others. Now, we are the most protected of citizens as university professors, given that tenure does protect you more than most, certainly more than people who work in independent industry. Mm-hmm. They aren't able to criticize their employer, for example, and they can be fired for speaking out in a way that would discredit the employer. So I can understand that fear here. But if university professors won't, and again, I get it. I'm just saying that courage begets courage. So we want to make sure that as much as we can, and even take the lumps. I don't know. Last thing I'll say, and then we'll move on from it. It's you look back into the 1940s when people were literally having to risk their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no shortage of brave Canadians who just did that because they knew it was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering where that courage is today.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a place for covert and overt. We need both. So I'm not trying to be harsh. I'm trying not to give excuses to other people either.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have a question.
Okay.
What about this term woke? Because I gave some examples. We keep throwing it around. How do you define woke? And even more than that, can you touch on the three main principles that you think comprise the woke worldview?
Sure. So one thing I would like to add, just quickly, Dave, in response is I agree with you. And I feel like I am much more courageous than when I started this. And I'm much more courageous being here. It's something that I wouldn't have done a year and a half ago. And so I'm building up my courage. And my plan is to be able to go public.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That's what I'm working towards, and I agree with you that is the ideal. Okay, so as far as woke and how I define it, woke is two things to me. It's a worldview, and it's the people who are conscious of that worldview, knowledgeable of it, and who adhere to it. So it's a pretty narrow definition of woke, and that was intentional because like any term, any term can be used too broadly and too loosely. And so I wanted to have something that was quite narrow, and that's what it is. So it's either the worldview, which is the critical social justice worldview, and it's the people who are conscious of that worldview and who adhere to it. And so the worldview itself, like you said, is defined by three different principles or axioms. Two of them there are from James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose. There's the knowledge principle, that all knowledge is socially constructed. And then the second is the political principle. Political principle is that not only is knowledge is socially constructed, but knowledge is constructed by oppressors to advantage themselves at the expense of the oppressed. So that's the political principle. So, and the third principle, which is one that I kind of have added, is called the subject principle. And that's that people are primarily defined by their group identities. So according to your identity, you're either an oppressor or you're oppressed. And the important thing about that is that you behave according to your identity in order to perpetuate the existing structures of oppression. So that, and of course the oppressors, they behave in ways that perpetuate these existing structures to advantage themselves.
And if I had to, so let's pretend I'm explaining this to my kids, which I am, and I will, and I think that the model you gave is excellent. So when we say that the three things that kind of make up the world or the worldview or the perspective of woke, I want to just dig into the knowledge. So knowledge, you said that all knowledge is socially constructed. Basically, they're saying that truth isn't real. Is that an easier way to say it? That there's no objective truth? Is that right?
Well, I think it's not that there's no objective truth, just that we can't get to it. Nobody can get to it. It's almost like it's a Kantian thing that, there might be a truth out there, but because of the constraints on our mind, it's not possible for us really to get at it.
And so if you've got that, then it allows you to say, so this could be truth, or this could be truth, or this can be truth. You can play a little bit more fast and loose without having to worry about evidence or facts. Would that be true?
So yes, ultimately it implies that there's all kinds of different ways of seeing the world and seeing truth. Different ways that knowledge can be constructed, and that's empirically even true. Different cultures have different ways of seeing things, different religious backgrounds or whatever, and so that's one aspect of it. That many different people look at the world in different ways. So obviously, this is knowledge itself is constructed and it's relative, and importantly also the implication is that no one way of knowing has any authority over any other. They're all equal. Superstition is the same as religion, is the same as science in terms of their ability to get at knowledge.
And then with the political thing, and then I'll turn it over to Will for another question, but with the political thing then, so even though we say that truth is unknowable or objective truth can be variable, but they say, but when a knowledge claim is made, it's made for a political purpose, and it's typically the majority population, maybe it's white men, doing it for their benefit. So it's not really the fact, it's just this idea put forward as fact so that it can benefit the majority population. Is that the political side of it?
So I think it's more than just the majority. That's almost like a democratic argument. It's narrower than that. So it's whoever happens to be the oppressors, and that can be a small portion of the population. They're the ones who have the power to create knowledge through control of language, say, and in the mechanisms of defining what is real knowledge. It's the oppressors who have the power to do that, and they construct it in order to advantage themselves. So it's not just the largest number of people, it's whoever happens to be the oppressors.
And they've got this worldview then where they're saying that, I don't want to keep beating the dead horse, but knowledge can't be known. There can be this political element to it. What do they take that worldview, and how do they, how does it drive them ethically? What does it make them do? What's the political project that they're trying to do now that they've got that worldview?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think there's a slight difference, right, between these three. You can understand what the worldview actually is from these three principles, but it's slightly different. I think the worldview itself is something like we live in a reality that's inhabited by individual subjects with little personal autonomy that are driven to behave according to their group characteristics to maintain existing structures of oppression. So it's like this pretty grim view of the world. So that's what those three principles lead to in terms of what the worldview is like. And so your next question is, well, what does that imply, or how does that map on to the ethos or the woke ethics? And that's basically that, okay, so we have this terrible world that exists with all these oppressors that are kind of playing with the rules in order to advantage themselves. Well, the woke ethos then is to oppose oppression, dismantle all existing institutions that are necessarily corrupt because of the way this system is, destroy or dismantle the existing institutions, structures, and sites of oppression, or at sites of oppression. So, you're a syllabus or an ad that you see on TV. All these things need to be reconsidered and dismantled, and the institutions around them also need to be fought. And so that's kind of the overall, the dominant ethos about it is opposing oppression, dismantling institutions, and but the political project in this particular kind of view of things is a word that we hear a lot. The political project is equity, and equity itself is the retributive redistribution of resources from oppressor to oppressed identities.
Yeah, I think that anyone listening who's had some experience with this would say you nailed it when you said if you had to give one word to their political project, it is equity as they define it. Mm-hmm. Certainly. Will, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I have to add another quick question. I want to get to the later parts of the book too, but what's the goal of the woke? We've defined woke, and actually, Charles, you just kind of mentioned it quickly in the last couple of sentences. I heard opposing oppression and dismantling institutions. I want to riff here a moment on James Lindsay. I'm a huge Lindsay Pluckrose Boghossian fan, and I listen to a lot of Lindsay's content on New Discourses. And he had one podcast where he talked about what was it, like communists don't know or Marxists don't know, and the thesis was that they don't even understand what the utopia is that they're striving for. What do you, and this is too big a topic, but give me kind of your sort of elevator pitch. what do the woke think they're going to achieve when they've dismantled, the universities and the legal system, et cetera?
Well, yeah, I think, well, as the saying goes, it's easier to tear things down than it is to build things up. And I think they've got the tear things down part down without too much trouble. The build things up, I think, is a little bit less obvious to them. It's ultimately kind of a nihilistic ethic, but yeah, I think the idea is that you would have institutions in place that said, well, you can think about Ibram X. Kendi and his Ministry of Equity or whatever it is that he proposed. I can't remember the exact term. It might be something like that you could imagine. So you tear down all the institutions that we have, and when they get rebuilt, the result will be that there will be perfect equity. But not exactly perfect equity, retributive equity, so that previous oppressors will have a smaller share of the pie than the currently oppressed. And so I think that's the idea that, in the future, when there are these new institutions put into place, then it would be for certain that there would be 60% of citations would come from women. Even women only make up 51% of the population or 52% of the population, but because they've been oppressed in the past, that the new system that will be put in place will ensure that there's a new equitable proportion of citations that are given to women. And it reminds me a lot of The Road to Serfdom, if you've ever heard of that or read that by Friedrich Hayek. And he talks about the parallels, the parallels between National Socialism and the Soviet Union and collectivism more generally. And basically what he argues is that those two systems, what they had in common was a predefined morality that they felt that all of society should follow. And they put the institutions in place, or in order for that particular narrow, unique morality to be followed, it required an enormous amount of state control in order to force the outcomes that they thought were necessary. And so I think it has to be something like that. You tear down the current institutions, you replace them with ministries of equity, and you make sure that everything is distributed to in the proportions that the Ministry of Equity decides are appropriate.
I was reading today that the Toronto District School Board is going to abolish, how did they phrase it, sort of merit-based admission standards for focus programs like art programs. You don't have to prove that you're a good artist. Mm-hmm. For example, they're going to just, anyone who is interested puts their name in a hat and they're going to pick it out by random. So you don't have to be a good artist to get in the art program, or a great mathematician. It's going to be unmeritocratic by design. And actually, now I just want to go on a second tangent. This definition of equity in your book is so fabulous. And then I was listening to your interview with Benjamin Boyce, and he rephrased it and made it even better. And I just want to read it out to you because it's so good. Equity is the destruction of everything in order for a retributive redistribution of power, and here's the key Boycean part, along the inverted axis of the prior hierarchy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. Douglas Murray in The Madness of Crowds talks about this inverted axis as well, or an inverted pyramid. Yeah, I think that's that's basically what I just explained, isn't it?
Yeah. I thought Boyce kind of twisted a little bit and got it, made it even better. Anyway, it's beautiful. I'm going to have it tattooed on my forehead. So anyway, the question I'm really supposed to ask you is that, you've made it pretty clear that critical social justice theory is the intellectual foundation of the woke movement. But then, and in fact, there's a recommendation, I think in chapter 2, that, people really have to learn a little bit about it to combat it effectively. But do we really have to do all that homework? Or can we combat wokeness using liberal principles? Is it sufficient just to believe in free speech and freedom of conscience, or do we actually have to do our homework on this thing?
Well, and I think Dave was sort of intimating this before, is that it's definitely not enough simply to believe in freedom of speech and conscience. Something has to be done. And in order to be able to do something, I think you need to understand what it is that you're up against. And in order to do that, well, you need to have a little bit of knowledge. And that's what I tried. I tried to distill it to what I thought were the really important bits of information that you needed to know about the worldview itself, in order to kind of put you in a position of having a sense of what it was that you're up against. And we already talked a little bit what it meant, this dystopic ministry of equity. But you're up against people and a whole movement that don't believe in liberal rules, that don't believe in liberal rules. Sorry, I covered the microphone. They don't believe in liberal rules. So the rules of freedom of speech and conscience, of giving people the benefit of the doubt, extending charity to people, these things are no longer rules. They are all up for grabs. And the reason that they're all up for grabs is that this movement and the people who adhere to it are fanatical. And the ends, one of the things that I didn't mention actually, but there's the woke ethos, and what it implies is the old saying, the ends justify the means. Well, many different things will be thrown out the window in search of these utopic goals. And so I think people have to recognize that. And that's why so many strange things seem to be happening, why people seem to be doing such unfair things, such vicious things, is because we're not playing by the same rules. That liberal rules, the ones that you mentioned, freedom of speech and conscience, those are considered to be rules that were developed by oppressors in order to disadvantage and take advantage of the oppressed. Their rules were rigged intentionally by the oppressors. So when the oppressors say things like, oh, well, we should have freedom of speech and freedom of conscience, they'll say, well, those are the master's tools. And so those are not the rules anymore. And they're certainly not the rules that we'll abide by.
Which is fascinating. And I want to kind of encapsulate, because you've really made it clear for me, Charles. Just Will's question was, can you just be arguing these liberal principles of freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom from discrimination? And you're saying you can't, because they now have cast those as evil. Mm-hmm. And then that brings me to a larger issue, which I found, and I think I could give some proof for this, but they're not good faith actors. No. Part of the classical liberal tradition is that we're going to go into this argument and we're going to play fair. Mm-hmm. And they think that that again is just a tool of oppression. I'm reminded during the Freedom Convoy, many social commentators on the left, which just happens to be almost every mainstream journalist, mm-hmm. began to say that waving the flag was a right-wing activity. Mm-hmm. And I think in that, we begin to see how they operate. Anything that would be a true sign of freedom, anything that would be a true sign of liberty, they then will cast as some kind of villainous activity, and therefore they can dismiss it and they don't have to follow it. And
dismiss and demonize.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so this goes back to your point, and I guess it was Pluckrose and Lindsay who came up with it first, the political aspect of the woke. This is where if it is something that exists, if it's something that we take as even a virtue, it was constructed for a political purpose, and its purpose is oppression. And they can do that with everything.
Yep.
So we're going to have to get into then what do you do? So let's get into that then. Okay. So what do you do? What do you do? How do you fight when they are saying that knowledge objective truth doesn't exist. I know it's more nuanced than that, but they say something akin to that. And they say that based on their political principle, that all knowledge is just the master's tool meant to oppress others, and therefore we can dismiss it. And they even say the point that you bring to it, that really it's all about the race of the person, that you're not really an individual, but you embody the character of your race, and it's all about racial tensions. How do you rebut that? What's the easiest rebuttal to all those claims?
Well, I mean, I think the easiest rebuttal to all of them is prove it. I don't know what the thing. Well, it's kind of the reason why it works in a way to maintain that these principles are real is because each of them, and James Lindsay talks about this too, is each of them has an element of that is true, right? I mean, we can't be naive and think that, okay, well, there's truth out there and someone says the truth and it's the real truth and we can't worry about it. We see all the time that people are constantly trying to influence what is perceived to be the truth. And so that notion that truth itself is, I wouldn't say debatable, because I think there is like there is truth even behind any of that, but it's not crazy to imagine or to recognize that people will try to kind of force a truth or tell a tale about what the truth is. And the same goes for that basically is the political principle or the notion that knowledge is socially constructed. Well, yeah, of course, knowledge to a certain extent is socially constructed, but it's what happens with each of these is that these obvious common sense claims are then used and extended to this much more dramatic and extreme position, which is, so as a result, because sometimes not everyone agrees on the same thing, well, then therefore there is no truth, or it's impossible to get to figure out what the truth of something is. Or similarly, because people try to influence the way information is expressed to advantage them, then all information is like that, and it's not possible to get to truth. And so it's kind of like a reverse Motte and Bailey. This is a term that we talk about in the book. The Motte and Bailey and then the reverse Motte and Bailey. But this reverse Motte and Bailey is you put forward a common sense claim that everyone will accept, and then you use that to extend it to to an extreme, and that's the more difficult position to defend. But anyhow, so I think the main rebuttal, if people were to say, okay, well, we don't know that truth doesn't exist anyway, and it's just created by the oppressors for the oppressed, is just to say, well, I mean, what is the evidence for that? And it's impossible. It's basically unfalsifiable, and therefore basically impossible to prove.
Right. Thomas Sowell used to say, whenever you are debating someone who's on the left or the far left, some of the questions you should ask are compared to what as well.
Mm-hmm.
Often, Canada is a racist society.
Yes, absolutely.
So, a good question is compared to what?
Yeah.
Another one he likes to ask is at what cost? So, we can make a utopia if we gave everybody $1 billion.
Yeah.
So at what cost is another really good one. I want to get back to your book, to dig right into it. You talk about the practitioners of woke, and you describe them as there are really three basic woke practitioners. Now, you talk about at the university, but I think these people are also on the job site, probably maybe in somebody's church. Can you describe these three practitioners, how we would identify them or classify them, and then also move into the people who are the anti-woke that may be in your midst and who you could join with?
Mm-hmm. You bet. Oh, okay. So there's two different elements to this. One is the definition of, or maybe the characterization of these different types of what I call participants. And then the other one is how you identify them. But it's like the main people who would be proponents of woke, or who would, the proponents of woke, or the practitioners, as you say. There's the woke themselves. These are the people who know about the critical social justice perspective. They're trained in it often, and they adhere to it. These are the people who are also typically fervent in their beliefs. If Will was talking about Benjamin Boyce, one of the terms that he used when I was talking about this was true believers. So these are like true believers in this woke pseudo religion. I don't think it really qualifies as a religion. But then after that, there's the people who are called the woke proximate, or that I call the woke proximate. And these are people who they adhere to the critical social justice perspective, and they are typically supportive of its policies and the things that they try to enact, but they're not trained in it. They don't really understand it, and they're also often like well-meaning people. I see them a lot in the sciences, and so they basically just don't understand what woke is, but they think it sounds nice, and they want to support that. And then there are the opportunists. And so the opportunists, obviously, these are people who feel like they've seen the writing on the wall. They see the direction that the wind is blowing, and they're not going to get in the way of the critical social justice perspective, and they'll take advantage of it if it helps them advance their careers. And so those are the kind of three people who either actively try to propagate the critical social justice perspective, or at least won't get in the way in these opportunists. But it's funny, my thinking on this has changed a fair bit. I wrote this a long time ago now, a year and a bit, and the woke proximate, they seem very fervent to me now. And I see more and more of them who are more and more fervent as I try to push back on these things in my own circumstances, and it's surprising to me. Anyhow, these are kind of
just a quick question. What do you think's hardened them? Because I would agree that these people don't really know where these ideas are coming from, but they become more fervent. Yeah. They really believe in the truth of these ideas without knowing their origins, or without really thinking deeply about the impact. So what's happened?
Well, I mean, George Floyd, it seemed to me like that's where everything really changed all of a sudden. That's when the National Academy of the Sciences was saying, decolonize science, or whatever. It was like around that time that things shifted all of a sudden. And I mean, that is a mystery, not a mystery, but a complicated, difficult to understand phenomenon. I mean, I think part of it had to do with people having been locked up with COVID. There was, obviously a highly polarized environment in the United States, with the former president and him being offside of all, basically, public and the right thinking people in the U.S. in all of their institutions, the academy, the media, so I think it was almost like a tinderbox that was ready to blow, and that set it off. And I mean, maybe Dave, you have a different view of that, but that's what it looked like happened to me.
Yeah, well, I'm a firm believer in tipping points. I mean, we see it all the time, that maybe you just finally critical mass happens, and the population just follows.
Yeah.
It's sort of the 80-20 principle, if you like, that if you can get a hardcore minority who are really rah-rah on something, other people will just fall in line, which maybe would give us hope. One thing,
exactly. I think that's right. In fact, I hear different numbers. 80-20. I've heard that in different contexts, but the number I hear often, especially in this counterinsurgency, is like between 6 and 8%. That there's 6 and 8% who are the true believers, and they're able to kind of drive the agenda. And but it can happen both ways. And I don't know, I can't remember what it's called. There's this website that you can go to, you fill out a survey, and it's something tribes.
Yeah. No, I know that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it turns out that on either end of the perspective of the spectrum of these types of tribes, the extremes, there's about 6 to 8% of the population that fall into both those. Anyhow, I thought that was interesting. But so I think that there is hope, exactly, that things can be changed eventually. In terms of the people who are resisting, this
is going to give us hope. So please tell us about the people who are resisting in our workplace. How do we identify them?
Okay. Well, there's the woke dissidents, and they are people who know about the critical social justice perspective, don't agree with it, and try to do something about it. And they can be, some of them are very outspoken, so I'd put you and Will in those categories, but there's other people out there as well who are trying to do things. And then there are these latent dissidents. These are people who are kind of, like the scientist types who intuitively react negatively to the propositions of the critical social justice perspective, as well as its implications policy-wise, and but at the same time they don't really know what to make of it and what to do about it. And so those are the people who are ripe to be brought to the cause, if you will, but they need to have a little bit more information. There's another category that I have, and they're not exactly resistors or practitioners. They're called the uninitiated. And these are people who just aren't familiar with the critical social justice perspective, and they don't agree with it. But it includes, but they're not necessarily people who will fight it, because that includes some opportunists. There's some people who are not familiar with the perspective, they don't agree with it, but they're still willing to go along with it. Anyhow, so the main resistors: woke dissidents, latent dissidents. The easiest way to identify them, woke dissidents, often it's easier to identify them because they're outspoken. They identify themselves. Latent dissidents is a little bit more, less obvious. People are reluctant to be associated, especially because it's something they don't quite understand. And there is a large part, and one of the reasons why it's such an effective movement is this fervor and zeal also comes with an enormous amount of confidence, hubris, and self-confidence and self-righteousness. So it's often difficult for people to think, I don't agree with this, but I'm really going to look bad if I don't agree with it, or if I come out too strongly against it. So that's why it's difficult to identify the latent dissidents. But identifying the woke dissidents, that's pretty easy. You identify the latent dissidents by taking out the people who are woke dissidents and the people who are the woke. So a lot of it is about, and in the book I go into a fair bit of detail about how you identify the woke. And the woke, they use specialized terminology. They tend to come from certain disciplines, particularly the humanities and the social sciences. Increasingly other fields as well, but I should say the fine arts as well. Fine arts, humanities, social sciences, just about everybody who comes up through these disciplines now is basically woke. That's how they're trained, and there's pretty few people who in those disciplines who aren't, especially the ones that are coming out now. So by identifying the woke dissidents and the woke, then you can begin to try to figure out who the potential dissidents are. And then I propose in the book,
for example, I think from your book, you're saying the people who aren't using the magic words all the time. It's conspicuous by its absence. It's almost like, who doesn't keep saying diversity, equity, inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion? And then suddenly you think, hey, they don't throw those terms around all the time. And maybe that would be an ally. Oh,
exactly.
Geez, I use the word ally. Somebody who uses the term ally, stay far away.
Yeah, so that's exactly right, Dave. There are people who will be reluctant to use those terms, partly because they don't understand them, partly because they're suspicious of them, and so they kind of keep their heads down. And I think that those are definitely that's a really good way of thinking about how to identify latent dissidents.
No pronouns in the bio just came up in the chat. That's actually, isn't that crazy that has become in the Christian tradition? It used to be to identify someone, you'd draw half of a fish and the other person would draw the other half of the fish, and then you knew that they weren't a Roman spy. Now we have to look for pronouns in the bio.
Yeah. And Ukrainian flags, right?
or I mean, I don't know if anyone, I'd be surprised. Also, pronouns in the name on your Zoom account.
Right.
Okay.
When we're talking about the woke, now I've lost the label for the potential ally,
Latent dissident?
the latent. There we go.
Yeah.
I just had the most fascinating experience over the last 2 months with I made this public declaration in a faculty meeting, and I had some people email me quietly, and I had some chats with them, and there's this is maybe unique to the university environment, and maybe doesn't apply in other institutions, but university people always think they're the smartest person in the room because they got a PhD and they are an expert in their narrow field, but they obviously think that that applies to a lot of other things. So they don't feel like they need to learn about critical theory, and they feel like they can argue this thing out on the merits and on the basis of their understanding of the words. And this kind of leads into my next question is about woke tactics and about this vocabulary and these dog whistle words and these crossover words. Diversity, equity, inclusion sound fabulous, and I know what they mean. And so I can jolly well walk into the office of the Vice President of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and tell him or her or they, what for. There's sort of an intellectual, I don't know, hubris there that makes, in the academic setting, it's sort of hard to find those latent supporters. I don't know what the question is there.
Well, the question would be, what are the dog whistles? Like what are the things that you say that there are two major tactics, and this is coming from chapter 2. There's the woke dog whistle and the woke crossover words, which Will just mentioned. So what are those about? Just briefly, because we can't go into the full chapter, and we want people to buy the book. So what are the woke dog whistle or whistles, and what's the woke crossover words? What's that all about?
Okay, well, so a dog whistle, basically, these are words. I'll talk about the crossover words because very often these dog whistles are crossover words. But dog whistles are words that are used to communicate to other woke participants, but they can go unnoticed by the uninitiated. So they'll often be used for woke people to signal to each other that they're woke. And that will help. It forms a complicity, but it also allows them to coordinate, basically, and work together. And so that's something that you need to watch out for. But the key to the dog whistle is the crossover word. So these crossover words are words that are typically have a sort of a positive connotation. So Will was talking about diversity or equity, inclusion. All those are very nice sounding words. They tend to be non-technical as well. Everyone seems to, and this is also what you were saying, Will, is that people who are latent dissidents, they'll hear these words and they have an understanding of what these words are. Oh yeah, I know what inclusion means, and I know what equity means, and we all do. We all have an intuitive understanding, a common sense understanding. But the trick with these crossover words and why they're called crossover words is that, in fact, they have a dual meaning. So they have the common sense meaning or the commonly understood meaning that people who are uninitiated will assume is their right meaning. And then they have these radical woke meanings. And so there's equity, diversity, inclusion are good ones. The word critical is a really good one as well, because critical is, you'll hear that word used a lot, and to the uninitiated, critical sounds like, hey, yeah, that's good. We have to. It's important to teach kids to think critically, and being critical is an important thing. And but they don't understand is that critical actually refers to this like critical social justice, and so that's the trick. I think of these crossover words as improvised explosive devices, because how they're used within woke tactics. The words will be introduced, and then later on, once they've become embedded into a situation, the real meaning of the word will be kind of exploited and activated, and that's when that's an important maneuver to then influence a situation.
And this speaks to the the reason that you need to educate yourself at least somewhat on this.
That's right. Yeah.
It's almost like it's learning French. You need to know how to translate. One of the things, and really maybe I knew this for a while, but it was just in the last year where I finally came to understand that when the woke use the word racism or systemic racism, they are now always talking about disparity, just simple disparity in numbers. Mm-hmm. So if they see that there are 50 positions and 40 of those positions are be white males or whites, then they'll say, well, that, without any other proof, they'll say, well, that is systemic discrimination. Except when you show them, let's say, an NBA basketball team, which is 80% black, and you say, well, is that systemic racism? Because again, there's a disparity, a difference in the numbers. And they'll say no. But anyway, it's interesting to me that this is one of those crossover words, this word where I thought I knew what racism was, but now it is simply, if ever you see a difference in numbers, if it happens to be in a way that doesn't favor what would be visible minorities, then it's racism. Without looking at, now, as someone who's a social scientist, I know that there are confounding factors. There are always confounding variables. And for you to just say, oh, well, racism, without having done the regression analysis, without even having done the careful thought, it's just absolutely wrong. But all these very smart people, or seemingly smart people, are intentionally forgetting these basic ideas of empirical evidence and statistics.
Yep, I think that's a fair assessment. And racism is one of those words. It's not a perfect crossover word as I typically see them, because racism doesn't have a positive connotation, but it certainly does have double meaning. And,
right. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that, Charles.
Yeah, sure.
Will, do you want to rush to the end so that we can open it up for other, like sort of get to chapter 3?
Unmute. I was just, I'm not going to have time to look this up, but that new Ontario bill about anti-racism that Laura May Lindow was proposing, the definition of racism. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the definition of racism blew my mind there. It was like anyone who doesn't like anybody is a racist. But anyway.
Dave must know about that. Didn't you do a podcast with Jordan Peterson and Barbara Kay on that?
Yeah,
Dave?
we really dismantled that thing, and we were able to show all the ways that it was just completely a wolf in sheep's clothing. It was, as Will pointed out, it said that in terms of being anti-racist, you could be anti-racism meant anti-black racism, anti-indigenous racism, anti-Islam or Islamophobic or anti-Semitic. But missing from the definition was anti-Caucasian or anti-white. So de facto, it was like you can be racist against whites. It's okay, which is really, as Douglas Murray has suggested in his recent book, they're getting even more brazen in just saying, yeah, this is really what the motive is here. But let's give some hope to people who are here. So hope comes in chapter 3.
But okay, can I just mention one thing that I think is useful to think about is that particular conflict where, okay, why if there's an overrepresentation of white people among professors for the number of hires, say, that is considered bad or racism, but the disparities in racial distributions for the NBA or the NFL or those things, why is then that considered to be a problem? And the way that you get around that, or the way they get around it, is just to say that, well, those people are historically oppressed identity groups, so that there's like two sets of rules, basically. There's rules for the oppressed and rules for the oppressors.
Right. Well, and related to diversity among professors, since 2016 and probably before, the professors in all of Canada now reflect the proportion in the Canadian population in terms of diverse groups. So even now, we've reached what would be called racial diversity in the professoriate. from 2016, except we still, even to this day, increasingly, we see ads that forbid white people from being hired now. Like, I mean, more and more.
Yes.
2 years ago, 3 years ago, I think it was just a couple dozen. Now it is literally across the board. But let's have some happy news, Will. Let's get to chapter 3.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm just conscious
What
of
do we
the
do
time.
to fight this?
Yeah. Sorry, folks. We've got like about 10 pages of questions for Charles. And so I'm just looking at it, trying to figure out because I want to do something to close this off and then open it up to questions. Yeah. So, what do you do about it? I guess that's a good place to end, David. Why don't we talk about what do you do about it? And let me throw one out there. I mean, obviously this is from the book, but forming coalitions, I'm starting to think that's really important. That before you even take a step, you got to have a small group of like-minded individuals. And so speak to that, Charles, and speak to other tactics.
Even before Charles speaks, I just want to reiterate what you've just said. And Charles said it earlier, and I saw someone in the chat, it might have been Francis as well. So I called people to be brave, but the truth of the matter is don't be brave until you have a team. Mm-hmm. Just you need someone there to be your emotional support, if nothing else, but also there's strength in numbers. So before you go and speak truth to power, make sure that you have a team behind you. But Charles, I'll let you tell us other things that need to be done in order to push back against the woke in our organizations.
Oh, okay. So I do just want to add a couple of things. One, the very first question that I was asked about anonymity and all that, I wrote a post because the week before I wrote the post, I had seen both James Lindsay speak and Jordan Peterson. And so it got me, and both of them were asked this question, what can I do? First of all, I'm not such an important person in my organization, but also I have a precarious position. What can I do? And so I think those are interesting things to think about. And this question, as I wrote out my thoughts on it, one of them, like you say, is organization, other people. And it's something that I've noticed since I wrote the book, and I've been in, people have contacted me. I noticed that a lot of the people who are interested in these topics, they tend to be loners. They're like people who aren't comfortable necessarily with lots of other people. And but the key to success and being able to do many of the tactics that are the most successful is being able to do them together, identifying places where it's useful to make an intervention, because often, you're just betting your head against the wall. There's lots of situations in which you're outnumbered in any case. If once you start to get together with people, you can share information. You can share information about your organization, about the different types of advances that are taking place and the ones that you could have the actual potential to stop. The more people you get together, obviously, the higher the probability is that you can turn things around. But the number one thing is work together with other people. There's the book is full of all kinds of different things to do, but some of the key general thoughts on Wokecraft that I have is if you see something, say something. This is also tempered by, probably don't try to go it alone. But whenever you see something come up, someone wants to stick the word critical at the end of a course outline or the description of a new professor, you really have to kind of try to spot those words and say, I'm not sure I'm okay with that. With including that word, I'm not exactly sure what it means. Let's come back to it later and communicate with other people and try to come up with a common front on that. I think it's important we have a tendency, we're taught, and I think it's to our better natures to be able to give people the benefit of the doubt. But like I was mentioning before, we're not playing with the same rules. You really need to be suspicious and skeptical at all times. So when a word comes up you don't recognize, that seems like it might be weird, you have to look it up and find out what it means, because often it will be one of these special. Sorry, this isn't all positive, Dave, about things.
No, but it's giving people some strategies, Charles. So I'm grateful. I carry on.
Okay, and another thing that I think is really important is that if you encounter a woke advance, someone's trying to change a regular position or a position that is not woke to try to turn it into a woke position, then or they often what they try to do too is recruit other woke people to the particular situation that you're in. I talk about these situations like meetings. You have a departmental meeting, you have a faculty meeting within a corporate structure. You also have these types of things. They will try to recruit people with the same woke agenda so that they can make these advances. So you always have to, if people come in with a proposal for something, you recognize it as woke, you have to counter it, and then you also you should always have an alternative. Instead of doing it like that, you should do it like this. Instead of bringing that person, I suggest that person, and try to have control over those types of things. Avoid letting them use their words ever, no matter what. This is probably, I think it's like one of the most important things. It seems so unimportant, and I think that's why it's been so effective, but it actually turns out to be really important because of the expression that Dave used, the wolf in sheep's clothing, for crossover words. It's really important not to let these strange sounding words or not strange sounding words being used in strange ways. You identify them. You have to make sure that they don't get in. James Lindsay talks about stealing the Mott and bombing the Bailey. Basically, you always, if someone comes up with an extreme proposition or an interpretation of something, like I said before, they often are preambled by a common sense position. This is called the Mott position. And so to stealing the Mott and bombing the Bailey, you want to be able to accept the Mott position and say, yes, it is true. It's a terrible thing that racism still exists. But you also want to confidently reject the Bailey position. But I don't believe that means we have to dismantle all of our institutions because they're completely corrupt and systemically racist. We have to draw a line here, and we have to be sensible about this. Another thing that's useful to be able to do, especially if you're able to identify people to work with, you're looking throughout your organization for different sites of intervention, places where you can try to turn back woke advances or make non-woke advances. It's important to be able to aim high as well. So you can do it within your own department, but it's better if you can do it at the faculty level, and if you can do it at the university level or your organizational level, or even now all of this stuff is spewed out into the granting agencies. These are the kinds of locations you want to kind of aim as high as you can to have the biggest impact that you can. And this is all facilitated. In fact, it's not just facilitated, it's impossible unless you're doing it with other people. And just one more, there's many more, but one that's important, especially in an academic context, is making sure to vote. We get sent these votes for associate dean, this and that, and representative on the union and faculty council and all these kinds of things. You should never let that opportunity go by without trying to figure out if the people who are running for it are woke, and vote for the ones who aren't. And that is that can also be done. You can kind of distribute the information. If you're working with other people, you can say, okay, we'll split up the list of the names. We'll take a look at the people. We'll figure it out. And then if there's a lot of different people, then you can kind of suggest who they should vote for. And
just to build on that, at universities, the CVs for these people are all public on the website,
exactly.
Right? So you could just take a quick look at their publications. I remember David telling me when we first got to know each other, he says, just look at them. All the titles of the articles are the same.
Yeah. But also the bios, you just watch out for crossover words, or sometimes not even crossover words, like the real woke words. And it's not hard.
One of the things you said, Charles, that I did want to reiterate, you said aim as high as you can. And I'm going to even extend that beyond being in your organization. I think that we need to begin thinking about running for school councils. We need to become trustees. We need to
absolutely
be heading our municipal governments. Not only that, we need to be in even more involved in our governmental system at the provincial and federal level.
I agree. Yeah.
The world is run by the people who show up. It's
Yes.
as simple as that. And many of us, I think, we just keep our heads down and we try to work on other things. But now we really don't have much choice. I mean, the noose is tightening. Francis mentions that Lighthouse is a good group to equip parents. Also FAIR, which is the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, FAIR for All. It is an organization that is fighting woke in schools, more generally, very good organization. They're online. For my part, I'm going to be heading up a FAIR chapter in Waterloo region. So I would encourage people to search those out because as Charles was saying, we need to get together on all these things and we actually need to put our shoulders to the wheel. We need to do it. You just need to do it. Will, do we want to go to questions at this point?
Yeah. Let's go to questions. Let's go to questions. I think I'm just conscious of the time. And I'm also conscious of the fact that Francis is a Marxist.
Oh, is that so?
Historical materialist, not a Marxist.
So I don't think I want to give her a chance to rebut. But also it is quite late. So I just want to thank Charles so much for spending Mother's Day doing this with us. And I want to remind everybody who's attending to call your mother if you haven't already. We're going to try and do events related to Waterloo SAFs on an irregular basis. So keep an eyeball on the events page of the website.
Oh, and wait, look at the website. Go on the website. Take a look. Will McNally single-handedly has been hammering this thing together, and it is worth a look. Thank you, by the way, Will, for all the work on that.
Yeah, we've got quite a repository of published articles and videos spanning the last 5 years of our battle against the woke at Wilfrid Laurier. And it turns out to be quite an archive. Stay tuned to the website and we'll do something again in the near future. Thank you all for attending and God bless.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It was a great conversation.
Pleasure.
Pleasure, Charles.